Hello, everyone, and I have to say I'm very happy to be here. I have to take this out just for a moment. Before we begin, I wanted to say that I woke up this morning and looked at the newspaper, and the American poet John Ashbery died yesterday. John Ashbery was a major American poet for a long, long time. He also was a friend of mine for more than 40 years. I've written about John. I've been on stages with John. And it's a sad day for me. I'm spending the whole morning thinking about him. He lived a very long life, 90, which is an exceptionally long life. So we can't say that it's a tragedy, because we all must die, but it's nevertheless a very sad time. And I don't even know if his work is in Spanish translation, but I assume it is. And I know when I get back to New York in a few weeks, I'm going to just go back and reread a lot of John's work, because he gave something new to American literature, and somehow he embodied what was going on in the post-war period. And then the miracle was that he kept it going for all these years since then. So a great poet is dead, and I just want us all to say goodbye to him. The book is so much about the language. It's so much about the sentences. It's so much about the music of the language. As I was writing it, I felt I was dancing. And as you see, there are these very long, propulsive sentences that keep going and going. And I think they were pushing me forward, but I think an attentive reader would feel swept up in that movement as well. And so maybe a ballet of 4-3-2-1 would be more interesting than a film. I want to start thinking about writing other novels. I've already started writing something nonfiction, because I'm not ready to write another novel yet. But as far as I'm concerned, it's over. This book is in the past. It belongs to you. It doesn't belong to me anymore. And now I'm looking forward to new things in the future. It seems that Donald Trump is incapable of reading books. And he has even said out loud, he doesn't like the way books smell. So if a man doesn't like to smell books, I assume he doesn't like to hold them. And from all we know, his aides in the White House can only give him memos that are 1 page or shorter. So I don't think he could read a book. The question of identity and immigration in the United States, well, but think about it. Everyone in America is an immigrant, except the Indians, who were mostly slaughtered by the early white settlers. America is such a complicated country. It's a country that was invented. See, this is the first time that people actually sat down and said, we're going to make a country. The Spanish didn't do this. The French didn't do that. America began it. So it's an idea, whereas other countries are simply a group of people who found that they were living together over many centuries and organized themselves. America's an idea, and at its best, it's a very noble idea. It's a very inclusive place. It's a country that allows everyone in, and then they become Americans, whether they're yellow people or white people or brown people or black people. And this is, I think, a unique experiment in human history. The tragedy is, America at the same time is founded on two crimes against humanity. The Indian genocide that started almost immediately after the first British soldiers came to New England, and then the horrific institution of slavery. Slavery lasted for hundreds of years, and slavery is the poison that's inside the whole beautiful system that we've created. And the problem is that America has never faced the question of slavery honestly. We have never asked the right questions. And therefore, the conflict between the races and the idea instill millions of white Americans that they are superior to black Americans persists. And I think until we can face up to what we did, we're going to continue to be a flawed and even tragic country. Well, there are 4 of them, 4 identical boys living in somewhat different circumstances, each one, and each one evolving into a different person from all the others. Ferguson number 1, I think, is a boy. They're all very precocious and they're all very bright. You know, that's the fundamental thing to know about who they are. In a way, they're exceptional boys, but they each have their problems and their difficulties. Number 1 lacks self-confidence, I think. He's the least sure of himself. He's the one who's very hard on himself as well. And then he goes through this accident when he's about 16 and loses a couple of fingers from his left hand. And this shakes him up terribly. It's very tough for him. And this is the one, number 1, Ferguson number 1, who reads the poems to his father. He likes his father. His father's a quiet man who's had business reversals. He's lost his money for reasons that are too complicated to go into now. But he did a very generous thing in sacrificing his fortune to save one of his brothers from going to prison. And so, in a sense, he's a shattered man, and he doesn't communicate. He doesn't talk much. This is one of the features of all the Ferguson fathers. And Archie is surprised at how deeply his father loves him. I think he begins to understand this more and more, how his father is sacrificed to pay for him to go to Columbia University, for example, and how proud he is of his son, even though he can't really say it. And so he's there in his store, this little appliance store in New Jersey, sitting in the back room, repairing broken appliances. At some point, Ferguson 1 thinks that he reminds him of Dr. Manette from Tale of Two Cities, the great Dickens novel. You know, the doctor making shoes in the Bastille prison, a kind of broken character. And I think he feels a lot of compassion for his father. At the same time, during the Newark riots in 1967, they clash because his father's incipient racism comes out with terrible tirades against black people. And Ferguson, even though he's still quite young, for the first time in his life, he just tells his father, "Shut up, don't talk like that." So, still, these are normal kinds of conflicts between father and son. I'm not sure really that the written word is what's connecting them, but the father is moved by that particular poem by Eliot, which is a poem of tremendous resignation and despair. And I think Ferguson then understands his father's mental state when he sees how he responds to the Eliot and how unable, a month later, he is to respond to Martin Luther King's speech in 1963, the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. So all the Fergusons, except, of course, the one whose father died when he was 7, when the boy was 7, keep learning about their fathers. With number 4, it turns into tremendous conflict. And there's tremendous bitterness between them. So each story is different. Originally, I thought I would take all the boys deeper into their lives, maybe middle age or even old age. But then as I got into it, I understood that what I was writing was a story of human development. And the real amazing changes we all go through occur in the first 20 years of our lives. I mean, think about it. We start like this, and then we wind up as adults. So nearly every day, something new is happening to us in those first 20 years. And our bodies, our minds, our souls, everything changes, develops, and we wind up being more or less who we are. I'm feeling miserable and angry and frustrated. I don't blame Donald Trump for being the psychopathic maniac that he is. There are many such people in the world. What astonishes me is that more than 60 million Americans voted for him. And among those 60 million, it's astonishing to think that 52 or 53% of white women in the United States voted for Donald Trump. I still can't understand this. I've read every analysis explaining why this is true, and I still don't get it. I think what this election proves is, how angry so many Americans are and how much hatred there is in the country. Hillary Clinton lost because she's a woman. It was a misogynistic campaign, and even women are misogynists. This is what's so frightening. And I think even though she won the popular vote, she lost by the rules that America plays by that much. But still she lost, and I think it's a shock. And I think there's this big segment of the American population that was so horrified that for 8 years we had a black man in the White House. Think of the words, black man in White House. The very symbol of the country was somehow ruined for 35% of the public. And there was a tremendous backlash against having that black man as our head of state, that it somehow opened the door for a racist like Donald Trump to get a very big following. So I think he's a danger. He's a real menace, not just to America, but to the world. And I pray that he doesn't get another term, because 8 years of him would be, I don't know, would the world still be here? It's not even clear. Most of the books I've written take a long time to develop, and I'm not looking for them. They seem to find me. And then it's slow evolution until the form is dictated by the characters and the situations. This novel started in a different way. It was a formal idea that occurred to me, that I could write a book in which I tell the story of one person's life, but in 4 parallel versions. So it was an idea that was so exciting to me. And maybe this is why I said I've been waiting all my life to write this book, because I think deep down, this form was there, and this question was there, this big what if. And I got so excited by the idea. It just occurred to me one day. I mean, I remember I was sitting at the breakfast table eating breakfast, having a cup of tea. And suddenly I thought, I can do this. And then I immediately started thinking about how to do it. I didn't know how many characters there would be at first. But I finally hit on 4 as the perfect square. It seemed to have the best symmetry. It's the 4 seasons and the 4 elements and the 4 winds. There's something about 4 that seems to encompass everything. The book did not have a big master plan. I knew who the characters were when I started writing, and I knew that they would have different outcomes in their stories, but I pretty much improvised the whole thing. I would get into my room in the morning and say, to myself, well, what am I going to write today? Well, and something would always come, but I was never sure. I would start a chapter. I'd have 50 ideas and 100 different stories. And then I would push everything away and try to boil it down to the essential characters and the essential stories in each chapter. So I kept making it up as I went along. And I didn't even know what the end was going to be until I was about 2/3 of the way through. And then I understood the last line was going to be, he was married to a woman named Happy. and so, but that was late. And then I understood how to work toward the end because I had a sense of that end. But pretty much, I have to confess, the book was written blindly as a kind of, as I said earlier, a feeling of dancing through these sentences that kept me on my feet and propelled me from one day to the next into trying to discover what was going to happen next. America has had an open door, and it has closed that door many times in the history of the country. There's been reaction against new people coming, just as there is now in the country, especially among the Republicans and the Trumpites. These scary stories about immigrants have been going on for 200 years. We're in another one of these reactionary moments where we don't think it's good to have strange people coming into our country. The fact is, though, if you are honest about it and look at the story objectively, the arrival of new people in the United States has always reinvigorated the United States. It has made us a better, stronger, richer country, I think. But there are conflicts, and we can't deny those as well. There have been riots. There have been, one of the worst things that ever happened in New York City was during the Civil War. Well, the Civil War was fought over between the North and the South. The South wanted to break away and become an independent country in order to keep slavery and their way of life. They didn't want the national government interfering with their way of operating. So the war broke out in 1861. By 1863, there were people were being drafted. There was conscription. But the system then, if you had, I think it was $500 or $300, you could buy your way out of having to go in the army. So the poorest people in New York then were the Irish. These were the newest immigrants. And it's interesting how every new group of immigrants who've been coming into the United States, they're always called black people. The Italians were called black people. Hispanics are called black people. Well, anyway, there were real black people in New York at the time, and the Irish, who didn't have the money to buy their way out of the draft and didn't want to go in the army and didn't want to have to fight for black people, at least a big chunk of them, a big mob of Irish people, burned down the black neighborhoods of New York and killed dozens and dozens of people. The riots went on for a week, and they're called the draft riots of 1863. This kind of stuff has happened consistently, periodically, in the United States. So we're both things. This is why we're so divided now, too. I feel that we have half the country have always believed that we are people who are responsible for one another. We live in a society, and we must take care of everyone. And then there are others who believe that it's every man for himself. And, this great notion of American freedom. Just stay away from me. I don't want the government on my back. I just want to be a free person, and I don't want to help anybody. Just number one. And we've been divided like this since the beginning, and we're divided like that now. And I don't see any moment when we're ever going to resolve it. The works I do are the works I do, and I don't have a plan. I don't put labels on myself. I've never called myself a novelist of chance. I don't even know what that term means. I've never called myself a postmodernist. Some people call me this. I know that some people have called me a postmodernist. I have no idea what they're talking about. And I think this word chance is too vague. I think what I've been dealing with in a lot of my work over the years is simply what I would call the unexpected. And as we all know, the unexpected is part of life. It's what another way of putting it that I've devised is the mechanics of reality. So bizarre things happen to us, we think that they're outside of the norm, but that actually is the norm when strange things are happening to us. That's the only point I've been trying to make. I don't see any mystical interpretations of this, no theological interpretations. I'm just looking at how the world works and how people live their lives and what happens to people, and strange things happen. And I guess we can put this under the rubric of unexpected. But then we have to admit also that human beings are capable of making choices and decisions and plans. And sometimes we make the plan and we are able to fulfill it. We achieve our goal. That often we don't. Say you want to, you're planning on going to the town next to your town, and you're walking down the road, and suddenly you find there's a big tree that's fallen, and so you have to get off the road and go into the woods. And then you're in the woods and you meet somebody, and that person might have a knife and stick you in the chest with it and kill you. Or that person might become your best friend for the rest of your life. So the unexpected thing is that the tree fell. But there's no meaning in it. It's just, this is the way things happen. So what I'm going to do next, I don't know. I'm not a philosopher. I'm a storyteller. And I try to tell stories that represent the world as I understand it. I felt it was perfect, and I also felt that if I had more, the book would have been too long. and then no one could have lifted the book. It would have been too heavy. Quantum is mentioned. If you recall, Ferguson, two of the Fergusons get Jim Schneiderman as either a cousin or a stepbrother. And Jim is a scientist, and Jim teaches, or at least explains to young Archie some of the things about what he's interested in: irrational numbers, black holes, and quantum. And so if you recall Ferguson 4, who is Jim's stepbrother, he's writing a story called The Scarlet Notebook. And he says, he's very young, he's only about 20, and he says he's trying to write a kind of narration that follows the laws of quantum rather than Newtonian physics, and so that you can actually be in sort of two places at the same time. Or the book that you're reading is also a book in which you can write in. I mean, these are crazy ideas, but Ferguson is young, and he's experimenting with different techniques of telling stories. As he gets a bit older, and he writes these 3 short works, and then he realizes to himself, I have to go back to telling stories. This is the essence. And then he sits down and starts to write his first novel, which of course is rejected by many publishers before he finally finds one. But anyway, that's it. Quantum. It's interesting. But maybe it's a dead end as far as narration goes. It's funny you ask me. I mean, I'm in the same position as everyone else in this room. If I had a great answer for you, I wouldn't be writing books. I'd be running for office and try to create world peace. Well, I certainly pray that neither one of these men, with their very strange haircuts, does anything crazy. It would be so beyond the realm of rationality for either one of the two countries, North Korea or the United States, to start dropping hydrogen or even atomic bombs on one another, that I have a feeling that it won't happen. My feeling is that Kim Jong-un in North Korea has looked at the history of other dictators of recent years, such as Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, those people who were overthrown and killed. They didn't have nuclear weapons. And I think his strategy is that if he can establish a strong nuclear arsenal, then the West will not want to overthrow him. And it seems that he's getting to the point now, very quickly, where he's acquiring this arsenal. And so maybe that will lead to some kind of stalemate and some kind of opening for some kind of negotiations. I mean, that's what I'm hoping will happen. If he is crazy and suicidal, and Trump is in a bad mood, then something really terrible can happen to us. I started the trip in Scotland. My wife, Siri Husfeld, and I went to the Edinburgh Festival. They've invited me many times, and I've never wanted to go, because August has always been a time when I've been very busy writing. But this year they said, we're celebrating our 70th birthday. You're celebrating your 70th birthday. It's time. So we went, and we had it was terrifically interesting. Scotland is in very similar situation to Catalonia in Spain. There was a referendum a number of years ago about staying in the UK or not leaving, and they voted to stay. Now, with the Brexit vote in the UK, in which Scotland, I think, was 65% for staying in the EU and not leaving, there's a whole new push inside the country to break away from England and establish independence. I did not speak to a single Scots person who wanted to stay with the UK. They want their own country now. So that was interesting and understandable. But then again, my information is only anecdotal. I'm only telling you about the people I happen to talk to. And maybe there are millions elsewhere who have a different view. After that, we went to Norway and Denmark. I spent one day in Sweden, and then I've just come from Finland yesterday. Well, I think the most interesting of these trips was the one to Finland. It was fascinating. I mean, unprecedented in my life. The president of Finland, Sauli Niinisto, is a big reader of novels. That's already, we talked about the American president and his antipathy towards literature. Well, this is a man who loves books. And just 2 days ago, he invited me for lunch, and we talked, and then he interviewed me on stage in a bookstore. This was an extraordinary thing. But here's what I'm leading up to. Just last week, he was in Washington, and he met Trump. And so he told me about their conversation. And I don't know if you followed this news here in Spain, but Finland, a country historically menaced by Russia, and therefore they have a strong military. And they have a rather large Air Force, but the planes are getting old, and within the next 2 years or so, the plan is to start ordering new planes and refurbish the Finnish Air Force. Trump got up in public and said, I'm so happy to announce that the Finnish Air Force is buying, 70 planes from Boeing, or I think it was Boeing. But this was not true. Trump made it up. There's no deal. The Finns haven't even begun to consider which company to buy the planes from. So this man, this very literate man, who's now my favorite politician in the world because he was so nice to me, he had to get up in public and say Trump wasn't telling the truth.
He did.
Yeah. And so there you go. I think what I'm finding in Europe is the same anxieties that we have in America, the same rise of populism, the same antipathy towards immigration. We share the same problems in both parts of the world. The problem for us in America is that America's so damn powerful. It's so significant what we do. It's a lot more important what America does than what Finland does, because they have only 5 million people there. But I think the problems are the same. And it shows to me that what's happening is this world we've been living in for the last 70 plus years, the post-World War II era, which was pretty stable overall. It's been a pretty stable time. We had the Cold War, there were conflicts, but nothing of a major catastrophic, cataclysmic nature. I think the world order of these last 70 years, my whole life in effect, is crumbling or changing, and we're evolving into something else. And again, since I'm unable to predict the future, I don't know where it's leading. But we're going somewhere, which is a different place, seems to me. Yes, of course, Mexico has big problems with Trump. And yes, of course, I sympathize with Mexico in these differences, but I'm not going to be able to solve it. But I can tell you the two things, and it's probably a good way to end this press conference. The emotional heart of this book, the autobiographical center, and this, Archie, is not me. This is not an autobiographical novel. Ferguson shares my time and my place. He grows up in the world I grew up in. He lives in the cities I lived in, and he's 1 month younger than I am. But he is not me. But right at the very heart of this book is something I've written about in the past in nonfiction, in the Red Notebook, a little sequence called Why Write? And it tells the true story of how, when I was 14 years old, at a summer camp in New York State in America, with 20 other boys in the woods, caught in a ferocious electric storm, and how I witnessed the death by lightning of another boy, a 14-year-old boy. This experience is probably the most important one of my life. It taught me that the ground I walk on is not solid. It taught me that anything can happen to anyone at any moment. And that has informed all my thinking about the world and all the writing I've done in the last 50 years. So that story is embedded in the book, and it actually is manifested twice. And once to the protagonist and once to the witness of a sudden death by a young person. The other major event of my life, and it's one, again, that was purely unexpected, was meeting my wife, Siri Hustvedt, 36 years ago. She had come to New York a couple of years before that to become a graduate student at Columbia University. And she was, and still is, 8 years younger than I am. there was only one person in the world and in the entire universe that we knew in common. And it happened that I had been traveling, and I came back, and there was a poetry reading being given in New York by a woman who I had once been involved with romantically, someone I liked and still like very much. And this was the biggest reading of her life at a place called the 92nd Street Y in New York. This is the best, most distinguished place for writers to read their work. And there are 1,000 seats in the auditorium. So I decided, even though I was tired and I had just gotten home from this trip, to go to this reading. Well, Siri liked this woman's poems as well, and she went to the reading, accompanied by a fellow graduate student from Columbia, who was the only person we knew in common. And I knew this man was married. He was about my age, but there I saw him with this beautiful young woman, and I assumed he was having an affair with this. But he walked over, and he introduced us. So I didn't really say much because I assumed she was involved with him. But after talking for about a minute or two, he just turned around and walked away and went to talk to somebody else. And I realized they were just there as friends. And so Siri and I started to talk, and we continued to talk. And then when the whole thing was over, we went out and we continued to talk. And we spent that night together, and we've been together ever since that night, 36 years ago. So if I hadn't gone to the reading, and if she hadn't been with that man, well, but the whole last 36 years of my life would have been different. My daughter never would have been born. She never would have been writing for Vanity Fair or singing wonderful songs. And so much of the universe, my universe, would have been utterly different. And I have no idea what it would have been, but it certainly would have been the life I've led so far. So there you see your answer. Thanks.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you.